So to kick things off, I wanted to ask sort of a broad starting question. Tell me a little bit about how you got the idea to write this and what came to you first. Was it like the characters, one character, the topics, the setting?
So I'd never done this vacation. My parents were in-laws. It would go horribly. So that's how I wrote about it. It was at the tail end of the pandemic. I'd been locked in New York for like 4 years, 3 years or whatever. I really just wanted to go to a place with space. It was a lot of congestion. It was just hard to be at home in a small space. So imagine this, I lived in Boston for 10 years and I was never able to get to Martha's Vineyard because it was just so hard to get to Martha's Vineyard. Like, I think Obamas have taken over that whole place. So it's so hard to get there and I've never been there. So I'm like, okay, I really want to imagine Martha's Vineyard or Cape Cod and what a family would go there like. And I really wanted this couple to be kind of very idealistic about sort of spending time with their family. The best part of vacation is planning the vacation. It's not the vacation. Right. So she's so excited to go on this vacation and then it doesn't go well. So it goes as best as it can, I think. There's good intention. So I just thought about that. And I wrote the first half of the book with the in-laws. And this is what happens in publishing. You give it to your editor and your editor's like, can you write more? And so I wrote the second half with like the couple going on a second vacation. And it's sort of like two halves, two vacations. And I wanted to explore this couple's marriage in their 30s. I think the 30s is a really important decade. It's currently my favorite decade. And I think a lot happens in your 30s, like career-wise, kids, marriage, a lot happens in your 30s, you know? And I was thinking about sort of this couple in their early 30s and then their late 30s. I'm doing this seminar at 92Y called Marital Decay, and I guess I'm going to talk about what happens in your 30s to marital decay. But I think it's a really important decade because your 20s are so much about like finding yourself and like being a person of the world, and then your 30s is all about sort of creating connections and making friends. I'm trying to make more friends. This is my friend.
And yeah, so going off of that, I mean, I think something that I was really interested in, the book. So, Carew and her husband Nate are like really high achievers, right? Like she's worked really hard to sort of make her way up at this consulting firm. He's worked really hard to make tenure at his professor job. And so they work, and they sort of get there and they're like, was this all worth it? Like, we barely see each other. We're like overworked, like, so So I'm curious, like, was that like an examination that you were after as well? Like, we work so hard, late 30s, you're sort of like starting to enter the middle of your life and you're like, WTF, was this like all worth it?
Right. I think that is true. I mean, you get to a point where it's a checkbox, right? You check all these boxes and you do a good job. And then there are no more hoops, right? And then you're kind of like stagnating. And Carew and Nate don't have kids. So that's like a big thing that I think defines a relationship or a marriage and a relationship. And so they're figuring out, okay, how do we interact with each other beyond that, right? Work is one thing, but in the second part, Carew's like, we don't really have that many friends. Like, that's kind of a problem for us. And so it's sort of like kind of dealing with your 30s and your early 30s without kind of that community and that support. Yeah, and I think that is that thing. Like, for someone like them, they've gone through so much schooling. All of their 20s were in school, and then they get to work, and then, like, this is it. This is, like... they're just deluded a little bit. They're kind of disillusioned about the whole process. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, that happens.
It does. It's like when people go into therapy, right?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not speaking from personal experience or anything, but yeah, that tends to be how it goes. And another big part of this is sort of like familial tension between children and their parents, and what happens when children grow up to be very dissimilar to their parents.
Right.
And a big part of this too was sort of like a lot of the ideological and political divides between Nate and his parents. So Nate and Carew, they live in New York. They're a progressive couple, and they often clash with Nate's family, who are conservative and blue collar and from North Carolina. And I wanted to know, so when you started writing the book, did you sort of know that you wanted to dive into this sort of topic that is really topical today, or did it sort of just end up bleeding into the book because of the world we live in today?
No, I mean, I had a really hard time with the 2016 election. Not so much this election, because I was like, okay, I've already done that, so let's just do it again. I had a really hard time with the 2016 election, and that this is kind of a product of that. And it's, what I wanted to paint was that I don't think Nate's parents have malicious intent or are malicious people, and that's what causes this divide in this country. They're warm-hearted people. It's just they have different ideologies, and I think it's just hard to think about that. One thing in the book that Carew has to come to terms with, and Carew's mom mentions, is that Nate's parents raised him well. You have to respect that. You have to understand that, ideology or not, and that's something that she's thinking about. And I think I teach a lot of undergrads, and they're so devastated all the time about everything. They're so sad, and they think the world is gonna end, and they're like 20, and I was like, okay, well, get to 21 before the world ends. And they're so devastated, and I just think the world is so much bigger, and I think there's a sense of like, at the end of the day, you can't cancel your family. There's just you can't do that, right? Like, whatever you disagree about, they're family, they're blood, they're like, or chosen family. And so I wanted to think about that. Like, how do you interact with family that, yeah, you disagree on a lot of things, but you can't just not talk to them ever again. That's not life. That's not, and my students are like, well, why not? It's like, what, you can't do that. You just can't do that, and I think they'll realize that once they have families. But this idea of like, you can't just like completely shut your family off, and I see a lot of these articles about like parents not talking to kids, and I feel so sad about that, because it's like, you have to figure out a way to find some common ground, right? And that's what they're trying to do. It's hard, it's very difficult, but Carew never loses contact, I think, with Nate's parents. It's just, they're not best friends, it's not Gilmore Girls, right? And so that's just part of their dynamic, but I think it's important to keep the line of communication open.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I thought you did a really good job of writing about Nate's family and that tension. So, like I said, they're from North Carolina. They're from like the Blue Ridge. I think it's outside of Boone, right?
Yeah.
So I grew up like an hour and a half away from there.
Wow.
Yeah, in like a very conservative town that's like super red. And so I was reading this, and I was like, I feel like I know a lot of people that are similar to Nate's parents, and I can understand perhaps what it feels like to move away from a city like that to a bigger city, and then feel like you are dissimilar to some of the folks that you grew up with. And I'm curious, like, do you have like any personal experience with that? I felt like you wrote about it like in a really insightful way that's really sort of spoke to that very well.
Yeah. I mean, yes, a little bit. Like, I think, with fiction, it's always based on a little bit of personal life. My husband's family is from Maryland, so it's sort of like a little bit of, it was a kind of a cultural shock to kind of go through that. And we had very similar ambitions, but this idea of kind of being, like, one of the things that me and my husband bonded over, which I think Nate and Carew bonded over that I gave this book, was like being black sheeps in the family, sort of falling very, very far from the tree, and that being really difficult to handle, right? Like, sort of, you go to college, you get higher education, your worldview just opens up a little bit, and that's really hard to compare to someone who maybe didn't go to college or didn't sort of want to travel or things like that. There's not a right or wrong thing. It's just a different perspective, and perspectives change. And I think I wrote this book to kind of work through that, but I think I used to be a lot angrier about, okay, well, everyone needs to have this perspective, but like, I think that your perspective is your perspective. I'm not going to force any perspective on you. But yeah, it was like, I think it was hard, honestly, for me, just as like a person going through all that education and thinking about the population of America and how divided it is, and how it's like not homogenous, and it's, I think at the end of the day, it's kind of a good thing because people disagree, but there's a lot of conversation, so it just made me think a lot.
That's a good thing. A good and a bad thing sometimes, depends on what you're thinking about.
No, I mean, like, my husband reads everything I read, I'm always like, reread this, And he's like, okay. And then he's like, I'm not going to talk about this book with you anymore. And then he like moved on, right? So I wrote a fourth book, and it was about these people who like fall in love at a residency. I made my husband read it. He's like, I'm not talking about this book ever again. Fine. You know? So he always vets it, but he never like wants to talk about it afterwards. Yeah. He's like, I'm done. I read it.
And so you mentioned, having a little bit of like autobiographical connection. And it seems that you and Carew have a few things in common as well. You guys both went to Harvard. I believe you also...
Well, she went to Yale.
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry.
Yale's a little different.
Sorry, I went to public school. And you both immigrated from China when you were young with your parents, right? Okay. And then you both live in New York. You both have adorable dogs.
Yes.
Any other sort of like personal experiences that you drew on when like writing this character or the book or any of your books?
I think with Carew, I really want to just create this character in the corporate world that was like very, very stable. I think in my last book, Joan, and this character, I wanted to create this like very, very stable Asian American female protagonist. I just think I grew up, I'm not mentally stable, but my friends are, who like went into law and medicine and consulting. I'm not stable at all. So I wanted to write to that because I felt like I wanted to represent them in a way. And I was in like this bridal party with 7 doctors, and I just felt totally out of place. And so I wanted to write to this like level of female competency. I really believe in female competency. It's not just Asian American. It's just this idea that this country needs to respect women and the work that they do. And so I am surrounded by a lot of competent women who are very stable and financially savvy. And I wanted to present that kind of character. That was just like an anchor for the relationship. And at the end of the day, sort of takes over the family as a matriarch role. I was actually thinking of August Osage County, the matriarch role. And I mean, she does kind of lose it, but this idea of like this anchor in the family, I'm always interested in that kind of relationship of like a matriarchal family, because I came from the matriarchal family of where like the female was the lead. And so both of my last 2 books have been kind of exploring that. Women at Work, I'm really fascinated by how work defines the female, how much of a double standard that is. I teach at Barnard, which is an all-female school, and it's just, you want to empower them, but then you watch, like, they make the choices that they make, and it's hard. And so I'm always about thinking about female empowerment through work. Virginia Woolf, Room of Her Own, being able to work. But then in my 4th book, it's, like, totally different. Like, this character is totally different. So I'm sort of, like, exploring different facets of that. But, yeah, there's that kind of, like, female competency I was looking for. I've always felt that, when the election happened, it was like, oh, this country hates women. I don't think this country hates women. I think this country loves women. They just don't respect women. They don't think that we can do anything. They don't think that we can lead or be in charge. And I think that's the huge bummer that I've always found, is that they don't respect female intellect, And I wanted to present a character who is highly intellectual and could kind of deal with it, right? Mm-hmm. Handle stuff,
Mm-hmm. And I mean, going off of that, you talk also or write about Carew and Nate's decision not to have children. And I'm in my 30s too. And it's definitely something that, if people decide not to take that path in their 30s, other people just don't really understand it. And, how that can sort of alienate you away from a lot of the friends in the circles that you're in, and how Nate and Carew feel that themselves.
Totally.
And how it's also sort of seen like as a reflection of you as a woman to decide not to have
100%.
children. How did you decide to write about that?
Well, one day I was looking at the census, as people do, and I was looking. It was like 1/3 of American couples don't have kids. I thought that was a huge number, 33%, right? Mm-hmm. I thought it would be something like 10% or something like that, given the messaging and media, Hallmark movies, Lifetime shows, whatever. I thought 1/3 is kind of a lot, right? It's not a majority, but it's a good number. And there's so many different relationships in that, right? Why people don't want to have kids, whatever. And so I did want to explore this. I'm in my 30s, I don't have children. There's a sense of like, what does that decision mean for the family? And I spend all of my time with kids, like high school kids, college kids, you know. And I think as a teacher, because I teach so much, I am helping the next generation. So that's what parenting is. It's teaching, it's sort of forwarding the next generation. So then you think about sort of that decision of not having children, and yeah, it can be very alienating. I think it's hard to kind of, for other people to understand why you would make that decision. But I actually don't think it's as common as like people think it is. I actually think it's not abnormal. Like I think a lot of couples are like that. It's just not. It's not really like put on movies and things like that. And so I did want to explore that. And I did want to explore what marriage looks like with a couple without kids, because couples with kids, you end up talking so much about your children, right? Like that. Obviously, you know, it's like this group project, right? You have to talk about the group project. So if you don't have the group project, what do you do? I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'll buy some houses and then we talk about real estate renovations.
Talk about your dog.
Talk about my dog. Yeah. The dog is like that. So it's sort of like common ground, right? Yeah. And I think I just referenced that movie where, you know, sometimes like very educated people overthink this thing about like having kids, right? And that's the trap. That really is the trap. It's like, am I doing a good thing for the world? Do I imagine a future for them? It's so existential, right? Whereas most people are just like, I'm just gonna have a kid.
Yeah. Overthinking is a thing. Yeah, for sure. And so speaking of thinking and intellect, you have an MFA from Boston University and a public health doctorate from Harvard. No big deal. And it's interesting because science often seems to play a role in your work.
Yes.
And I know you have a background in science, obviously. So I'm curious, how does science like play into your writing process?
I think science, I mean, sometimes it does. I recently wrote a story where I was talking about sort of like heart anatomy and things like that. So that was easy for me to think about. Yeah, I mean, I think science, it's hard. Like science and writing are very different. But both of them require exploration and curiosity. I think that's, it's really hard to teach curiosity. I've realized this for like college kids. They're not curious. I'm always like, what are you curious about? You know, curiosity is so important to a writer and to a scientist. Exploration, right? And I'm always like, just explore something you're interested in. She's like, well, can I just ask ChatGPT? And I was like, no, you can't. Curiosity comes from boredom. You have to be bored enough to be curious about something. And I think that comes from sometimes science research, that comes from writing. Science, honestly, STEM education, at the end of the day, gave me a lot of confidence as just a female in this country, like numbers, you know, there's this thing, anytime I tutor or teach like a girl, high school student, they're always like, I'm so bad at math. I was like, you're not bad at math, you know, it's just like the system, right? And I think STEM and science have always helped me build that confidence of like, yeah, you know, you understand this stuff, you can get your voice out there and explore. And being a good researcher means you can explore. Ultimately, at the end of the day, science was not something I was so passionate about that I wanted to explore. And writing was something I was more interested in, but both of them require a huge level of discipline. Like, you have to put in the work every day, you have to grind through, you have to do a lot of reading, you have to, you know, most of my students have never read a book. I'm serious, they've never read a book from beginning to end. They've read excerpts, right, like, but they've never read a book from beginning to end.
School?
Well, I forced them to read a book.
Okay, good.
And then in their response papers, they're like, wow, Weike, this is the first time I've read 300 pages. It's like, oh, okay. You're 21. But they don't read full books. And so much of any kind of STEM or like hard math education is you have to read textbooks. You have to read things from beginning. You have to learn stuff. And so forcing the kids to read books is part of the training, right? So I think they're totally relevant in terms of discipline. Obviously, they don't cover the same fields, but a lot of the practice is very similar. And I took so much of my work ethic from science into writing. And to be a good writer, you have to have great work ethic. Like Murakami wakes up at 5. I don't wake up at 5, but he wakes up at 5. He runs like 50 miles and then he writes like 5,000 words or something like that. I wouldn't recommend that, but he has this like habit of writing, right? It's not you go to a coffee shop, you get inspired, you write. And he reads a lot. And to be a good scientist, you also have to read a lot. You have to read a lot of papers, you have to read a lot of things out there. It's really hard to get kids to read. I don't know. I'm trying. I'm really trying.
Thank you for taking care of our youth.
I'm trying. Like, in some response papers, they're like, I'm only reading this book because Weike made me. I was like...
Are they not on Book Talk? I thought that was like...
No, but I was just like, Gabby, why are you writing this in the response paper? I'm reading this, you know?
I'm creating you. Oh, jeez, that's scary. Well, you also are very funny. I was laughing at your book. I thought there was some really great lines in there. But your humor is very, like deadpan, like it isn't performative or anything, which I found it was like really smart and sly. Can you talk a little bit about your relationship to like humor and humor in your writing?
Humor came pretty easily for me in terms of writing. That's I think what drew me to writing. In college, I took a lot of workshops, and it was strange when people were like, "This is funny," and I was like, "Oh, I thought it was just me being stupid on the page." But it was, I think that came naturally for me. The tip I usually give for humor to students is like, if it doesn't come naturally to you, just don't do it. It's fine. You don't need to be funny on the page. Being funny on the page is very different than being funny in person. And humor oftentimes is a coping mechanism. It's oftentimes a balance for serious issues. It's hard. But I think... No, I think I could not write something so serious that didn't have a little bit of lightness to it. Otherwise, it wouldn't draw the reader in. I'm always thinking about the reader's experience. Like, I'm always telling my students, like, think about me reading your stories. Like, give me a good experience, right? Like, make me laugh, or, surprise me, interest me. Sometimes they do that. So, but oftentimes the humor is a way to draw the reader in, to sort of, like, bring... Like, Chekhov was really funny. Like, he's so ridiculous. Kafka is incredibly funny. He also has a lot of gravitas, but Camus is very funny. Like, there are these writers that I think are known for their seriousness, but they're also very funny. And, Salinger, very funny, but also very serious, right? So there's a sense of that they both can kind of live in the same world. But the thing with humor is it's almost impossible to teach, The way that I teach humor is I'm like, it has to be a juxtaposition of two things that don't fit together, right? Like, you have to be able to put two things together that don't fit. But it's really hard to explain. Like, some of the funniest people I know aren't able to write funny on the page, and some of the most serious people I know are kind of funny on the page, and it's weird how that works, Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like that's life too, also, right? Like, serious things are often sort of like...
Yeah. When things are so bad, I just start laughing.
Totally.
Like when, everyone dies, you're like, oh my God.
That was hilarious.
You can't
run it back.
I don't know why. It's like,
I totally understand. Yeah, I totally understand.
Well, it's like in Modern Family when Clara's like, she always laughs when something terrible happens.
Yeah.
But I have that issue.
Yeah, no, I
like my friend's dad died, and I started laughing and I'm crying at the same time. And I just couldn't deal with it.
Yeah, your body kind of, it feels all the things at once.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned this a couple times, but it sounds like we can expect a fourth book from you. Can we get the scoop when it's coming out, and what's it about and all that?
So I'm in the process of editing it. I did sell it. I wrote it. Thank you. I wrote it in 12 weeks. I went to this
Holy shit. Oh, sorry.
I know. I went to this amazing residency in Italy. I met this guy, Kare. And then I just made a lot of friends. I had come off from in your early 30s, you lose friends to a lot of different things. And so I made a lot of friends, and I sort of wanted to set kind of like a romantic friendship in this residency as, what happens when two artists meet at a residency. And it's just been a really fun book. It's been very easy to write. I'm in the editing process. It's the first time I've been able to write, like an Asian American female writer. Like, most of the time I'm writing, Asian American female protagonists and or scientists. I was able to write a writer, and I was able to kind of mine the canon, because I've read so much of the canon, I was able to kind of like what I love writing about is writing. So I was able to reference a lot of, I love Emily Dickinson, I love Salinger, I love Graham Greene because he blows everyone up. It's amazing.
Hilarious.
It is hilarious. Like love bombing. Come on. And just all the writers that kind of created me in college. And it was nice to kind of write about a writer, and she has writer's block, and she's sort of like moving through this like friendship. And then, I guess it's not really a spoiler. It ends with this like 50-hour date in New York. So I'm trying to like figure out how to like create this date. I don't know if you've ever read or watched the movie like Before Sunset or like that. It's like a little bit of that.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Because that was a great movie for me as a child.
Oh, it's
yeah, it was so good.
Yeah.
And they just talk, and I just love characters who talk, about art. Completely useless, but
no, banter is
great.
Yeah.
And really fun. So I felt like this fourth book was like, I didn't feel like there was a responsibility for me. There was, for a lot of these other books, there's like, you have to represent and you have to do this thing. It's a lot of pressure. I always tell my students, writing is so much experimentation. Like to have fun writing, you have to experiment. But like to be a writer, a lot of times it's like representation, right? You have to represent your community, things like that. So oftentimes representation and experimentation clash with each other, and you sort of have to figure out like this gray area and how to deal with it. But no, I like this. I'm actually, I don't know, I'm okay with this fourth book. It's not bad. My husband has read it, and I like keep texting it to people, and I think it's gonna be fine. But I think it's gonna come out like maybe next year or something like that. It's a short book. I can't write long books. I don't know. I think it's the attention span. It's just, I don't know if I don't believe that a novel, the 300-page novel, is really that sound as a structure, I think about novellas that I love. Like, if you think about Breakfast at Tiffany, Of Mice and Men, those are all under, like, 200 pages, and they're clean, they're sharp, they're, like, amazing, Even As I Lay Dying is about 200 pages. It's a great book. So I think there's a sense of, like, the 200-page being a good amount, but the publisher is always like, you need 300 pages. And I get that, like, the sense of price per page. I was in a cab once, and this cab was like, how long are your books? And I was like, around 200 pages. He's like, so if your books cost $25 and there's 200 pages, you know how much I'm paying? And I was like, then you should just buy the Bible. Like, it's like the best value, the best bang for your buck,
It all comes down to business, sadly. Yeah, not the art. Well, thank you. Well, let's open it up to the audience. Does anybody here have, yes?
Kind of following on that, thanks, by the way, for reading and sharing. You mentioned this book, the fourth book you're writing, is easier to write maybe, or came to you quickly. You also mentioned Murakami's got his 5 a.m. running habit, and writing's kind of a job.
Yes.
Do you know when you're writing if something's like easy or challenging? Does it impact the quality? Do you get a sense for what you're putting together? Or is it all just kind of vibes?
Vibes. Gen Z vibes. My kids say this a lot, vibes. Okay, so it's gotten easier. Writing has gotten easier. The second book was the hardest for me. This third book wasn't bad. The fourth book has been quite easy, just because I had a lot of material to work from. And I've sort of been in a productive stretch, which has been great. But I think I've just gotten less, I feel like I pressure myself less. Like, I think after your first book, you pressure yourself to produce. And I've gotten a little bit better at being like, if I don't write for 6 months, it's fine. I went to this residency for like 5 weeks, and all I did was drink, which was great. I didn't write anything. And then I came back and I wrote for 12 weeks. So I think it's just like trusting the process a little bit, and I've gotten better at that. But after every book, I'm always like, I'm never going to write another book. And, that it's a lie, right? Because I'm a fiction writer. So I'm going to keep writing books. But yeah, this fourth book has been easy. I'm sure like every book is different, every book has its own difficulties. I could see the form of this book really well. I generally know when I start a page how long something is going to be, the vision for it. It comes with experience a little bit by the time. I usually tell students by the time you write the first paragraph, you should know how long something is. If you don't, then you have no sense of form. You have no sense of where the period is. And you need to know where the period is. So that comes with experience, which I'm very grateful for. But it also comes with reading. Like, you read stuff that's short and you figure out why that worked. You read stuff that's long and you figure out why you don't like it. Every long novel has a tragic flaw. Like, War and Peace has flaws. You know, it's very long, right? Like, you should just read the peace section. Oh boy. So like every book has a flaw, and I think it's, you read a lot and you realize what you didn't love about a story, but what you loved about the story, right? And you try to kind of put those things together. So, you just get better, you know. But it takes a lot of work to get better. You do have to read a lot. You do have to take classes. There's no such thing as just like genius. I know a lot of people are like, genius is really important. I don't think it exists. Right?
Yeah.
You know.
For sure. Oh, yeah.
I was curious, was there a tipping point, or what factors led you to move from science into fiction writing?
I felt like I could have a bigger impact in fiction writing than I could in science. The science that I was doing at this point, I don't really miss, and I was competent at it, but I had no real drive for it. And with writing, I've always wanted to get better, so I'm always reading. I'm always trying to become a better teacher, you know. And so I tell my students all the time, it's not talent. You actually have to care about it. Like, caring is really important, because once the grades are over, you don't care about your work. Like, there's nothing there, right? So you have to care about your work. And I do care about writing. So that was one thing that was a factor into it. And it was incredibly hard. I think no one knew why I did it. I think a lot of people still don't understand why I did it. But I don't regret the decision. I would do it again. I don't miss science. I think I'm always telling students, like, pick something that you think you will miss. If you don't miss it, you're never going to want to do it. But if you miss it, like if I did science, I would miss writing tremendously. And I don't miss science. I actually am super glad I get to write. But I don't write every day, guys. I'm like writing maybe like an hour every day, or like 2 hours every other day. I'm trying to drag out this editing process for book 4 as long as possible, because I really like the book and I'm just like really slow. And my editor gave me no edits. It was like, this is done, just do this thing. And I'm just trying to drag my feet through it. Because I don't want to leave the project. I'm so in love with the project. But I can't write like 8 hours a day. So I love what I'm writing. It's amazing. It's really good. It's like, I tell my students, like, it's the best drug. Even though I'm like, you shouldn't do drugs. But it is the best drug. When writing is going really well. So, yeah.
It is. Yes.
I really enjoyed the book. Just finished it this morning.
Oh,
Some
wow.
time for this. But one thing I was really fascinated by was like each character's like relationship with their respective in-laws.
Yeah.
In-law relationships are always interesting, but then there was also like the like ethnic background and the class divide. So I was wondering what your approach was to like writing those relationships, if you kind of like knew where it was gonna go, or it came to you while you were writing.
I had no idea where it was going to go. With writing, I generally just sit down and try to, like, write the scene. Sometimes I write a few notes to myself. A lot of the times writing is just figuring it out on the spot. It's a lot of problem solving. Like, I think if I could connect with some of it, it's honestly like writing code. Like, you have no idea what the fuck is what's happening in the next line, but you're gonna figure it out, right? So like that's what writing is. You put one block in, you put another block in, you put another block in. So, you know, I wrote yesterday. I didn't write today. I wrote yesterday, and I was like, I need to fix the scene. How do I fix the scene? So you write one sentence and you create another one. So I think I had a general idea of where it was gonna go, but I don't know until the day of. And that does cause a lot of people anxiety. I get that. But you just have to trust that you'll sit down and figure it out, you know? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. I had a question kind of about like your writing style. I feel like I read Omakase back in like 2018.
Oh, wow.
My favorite short story ever. And
Really?
I've been
Wow.
like reading your stuff since, and I feel like it all is so uniquely yours, like very, very like a unique style. And I was curious if you developed that over time, or if now when you write, do you just naturally write the exact same kind of like way every time, or do you feel compelled to stay within like this kind of style you've established, or
No,
do you still experiment?
I do love experimenting. I think there's a voice that I always aim for, but I love experimenting. I think, you know, I've written for Shouts and Murmurs, and I've written for the fiction section, I've written for nonfiction, and I've written for books. I think one of the things with writers is being versatile and changing our voice for that. Yeah, and Omakase was my first New Yorker story. That was really fun to do. I think you just, you know, you're always in an era, right? Like, I think you're in an era of a certain voice. Like, currently, my fourth book is called Iris, so I'm sort of in this era of Iris. And she's kind of naughty, so she's like, I'm sort of in that voice. And I'm able to kind of access that voice. But once I'm out of that voice, I kind of access other voices. So, it's range. I think one of the things that came from writing a lot is gaining a lot of range. Like, if I'm writing a Shouts and Murmurs, I have a different voice than I do if I'm writing literary fiction, you know? And I don't know, like, when I try to teach my students this, it's hard for them to see it, but it's like when Mariah Carey can hit different octaves. It's like different registers. Like, you have to be able to access different ranges of your voice to be compelling. There are some writers that have one voice and one tone, but then sometimes you want to be able to do a lot of other things. But one of the things, you know, I was talking to a friend about this today. I was like, how did you start writing? And one of the ways that I started writing is I copied paragraphs of writers that I admired. So I spent like a lot of hours just sitting there copying Didion. Didion spent a lot of hours copying Hemingway, right? I really like Salinger in certain aspects, so I just type paragraphs. And sometimes, you know, you type the paragraph and you're like, oh, Salinger, I don't really agree with this, I'm going to change it. And then you start changing it to the point where you sort of develop your own voice. So I'm always to my students, like, find a writer you love, imitate them, because you're never going to succeed. You're always going to fail. And then it's going to sound like you. So there's a lot of writers that I love that I was always, like, copying their sentences, and then it never sounded like me, so then you have to change it. So yeah, I always encourage my students to do that. I don't think they listen to me, but they should.
They'll just put it in ChatGPT. It's fine.
They use so much ChatGPT. It's crazy.
Do you have any other questions? Yes. Yep.
You talk a lot about teaching writing. How has that affected your own writing?
Well, sometimes I steal their ideas because I'm like, they're good ideas.
I read a book about that.
I know. Well, I know.
Yeah.
No, I don't steal their ideas, but it's a break. I don't think I can write full time. Sometimes, it's humbling. I think being a teacher of writing students. I'm a very casual teacher, so they tell me a lot about their life, and it's nice. You know, I get to know a lot of kids. Like, right now, I have like 40 kids under my wing for teaching. That comes with a lot of problems, like boyfriends, girlfriends, parties, you know, like breaking a heel, things like that. You hear all of it. And it's kind of nice to be adjacent to that energy. I like when they sort of like use slang that I don't really understand. And it's just fun. I think I actually like undergrad energy a lot. You know, I was reading, I think they inspire me sometimes. I was reading this like MFA thesis about clowns that was not very good. And then I was like thinking about clowns so much that I ended up writing a short story about clowns, and then I sent it to the New Yorker. So, you know, there's this like idea that like you read and then you're kind of inspired and you pick up that idea about it. It's also, there's this like, you know, adage or idiom, like, have you read this? no, I haven't even taught it yet. So like I sometimes have to teach. No, I'm going to teach something to read it. I've done this multiple times where I'm like, what am I going to teach? What am I going to teach? And then I read something, I'm like, okay, I'm going to teach that, and then I have to go in with that. So teaching has helped me so much with reading, organization, being a positive person. I have trouble being that, but I have to be positive for undergrads because you can't just tell them the world sucks, right?
True. No. Yeah. Well, the youth you're inspiring.
Yeah. I always have to be like, it's really it's great. So I don't know. You listen to, they're cute. They're very cute. But they're so young. They're just like, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, they'll grow up. Don't worry.
You teach?
No. Oh my God, no. I do not. No. Well, thank you so much.
Of course.
This has been so wonderful.
So fun.
So fascinating.